Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. In a recent Technique Tuesday video, which I will link to down in the video description, I explained how to determine the direction of knitting in items with simple stitch patterns like ribbing, garter stitch, stockinette, and seed stitch. In today's video, I'll show you examples of more complex fabrics made with stranded colorwork, cables, and lace. We'll look at an item that was started with a provisional cast on and figure out where the starting location was. Finally, we'll look at how to differentiate between shaping techniques like increases and decreases in order to figure out which way is up. By determining the direction of knitting, you will know whether an edge is a cast-on edge or a bind-off edge. Because there are cast-on and bind-off methods that match each other, you can't always look at the edge to determine whether it was a cast-on or bind-off edge. If you want to rip something out in order to reuse the yarn, or if you want to understand how something was constructed by doing some forensic investigation of the fabric, the first thing you need to know is which way is up. So let's get started. The first example I'm going to show with cables is for traveling twisted stitch patterns. And these are going to be the easiest ones to identify the direction of the knitting because you have single columns of twisted knit stitches that are traveling across the fabric. So by being able to look at a single column of knit stitches, you can see which way they are oriented. So when we look at this cable panel here, we've got this column of knit stitches here, and they don't look like exactly like a V like you would see in normal stockinette. They're crossed at the legs, but you can see that the upper part of the stitch is definitely wide, and then the lower part is crossed over. So you know that this sweater was knit in this direction. So one thing I will say is if you're looking at something like a sweater and trying to identify its construction method, we have seen that the body of this sweater was knit bottom up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the sleeves were. The sleeves could have been knit top down. It depends on the construction. It depends on a number of different things. So you would actually want to look at the sleeves as well and to make sure that this was also worked bottom up if this is something you're examining and wanting to understand how it was constructed. This is a similar type of cable. These are traveling cables, but they're not traveling twisted stitches. So what you have here are ropes of stockinette, so two stitches of stockinette that are traveling across the background of pearls. And so you want to look at this up close to determine what direction this was knit. So if we look at one of these ropes, well, we can clearly see that there is the V of a stitch here, but we also see on the side that there is a half of a stitch, and we can see half of a stitch here. And we can see in this two knits right here, we see that V in the middle and the half stitch here. You can see though in the ribbing that the ribbing was knit in this direction, and so these two stitches were picked up right in the base of those stitches so that there was no offset. But it's something to observe that the ribbing was knit in this direction, but the cabled fabric was knit in this direction. Here's one more cabled sweater. This one has stockinette based cables. So these are not traveling. You have columns of stitches that might be 6 or 12 stitches wide that are all in stockinette, and then you have the cable crosses within them. So these are completely vertical columns. So we can take a close-up look at these cables and see which direction those were knit. If we look at this one here, we can see the V of a stitch, but then we see a half a stitch over here, and we can look on the other side and confirm that. And if you're ever unsure, just turn the fabric in the other direction and see if it becomes more clear. So when I turn this upside down, I can see this stitch right here. I can clearly see a V, and then there's nothing hiding next to it. These are just purl stitches. So now I know for sure that the direction that this was knit was this direction. So in this case, this sweater was knit top down, and when you look at the ribbing up close, you can see that stitches were picked up and the direction of the knitting for the ribbing was that way. With stranded color work, one of the easiest ways to figure out the direction of knitting is to look for a single stitch that's of a different color than the surrounding stitches, or for a whole column of knits that are in a single color where the stitches on the other side of it are different color. So we can see that right here. We've got a column of dark blue, a column of this lighter blue, and then another dark blue. And if we look up close, we can see that the V's of these stitches are upside down. So once we turn it this way, we can see for sure that these columns of stitches were knit in that direction. And you can confirm that with the single stitches of color, that they also look like a V that is oriented in the correct direction. What I have here is a scarf. It's a lace sampler scarf, so there are a lot of different lace patterns here. And I wanted to use this as an example because I think lace might be the trickiest of the different types of stitch patterns to try to identify the direction of the knitting. So I'm going to go through these different stitch patterns and we can look at them. So let's start down at this edge. And again, we're going to look for any place where there's a single column of stitches, if we can find something like that, or a line of decreases. And we can see right here we have this single column, but you can also see that the V's of these stitches are upside down. So if we turn this way, we can see for sure, okay, that is a single column of knit stitches. This particular piece, we know for sure was knit in that direction. So now let's look at this one. And I'm looking at this and I'm having a hard time telling if this is the direction of knitting. I don't see anything that's telling me that for sure that this is the direction of knitting. So when you are looking at lace, if you're not sure, or any stitch pattern, turn it the other direction. So now when I look at it in this direction, I'm starting to have a little more clue. I'm looking at these yarn overs right here and then at the stitches that are next to them. See how you can see this line of knit stitches right here. And then here's another line here, and then we have a decrease. We have one stitch on top of the other. So we can see that that is a decrease, a left-leaning decrease. So that was an SSK. So we know that this one was knit in that direction. So let's look at this one and see if there are any single columns or edges adjacent to yarn overs where we can tell for sure which direction we're working in. So I would say these edges right here are really difficult to see what's going on, but we can see this single stitch right here, and we can see the V of that. We can see these yarn overs right here, and we can see that at the edges of each of these, we've got this column of V's of knit stitches here and a column right here, and then there's this middle column, and so there's some kind of a double decrease here at the very top. But that's what I'm looking at, is using these yarn overs as edges. In some places, it's not going to be obvious what's going on, like right here. But in other places, it's going to be a lot more obvious. So this was definitely knit in this direction. This one is pretty simple. We've got these diagonal lines of yarn overs, and we have a row of stitches. And again, this one looks like it's probably upside down. So I'm going to turn it this way, and now it becomes more obvious that we have this line of knit stitches coming up along the side of these yarn overs. So we know that this was knit in this direction. Basically what I just did was I went through each of these squares, and sometimes I oriented them in one direction and some in the other. But all of these were knit in this direction toward this edge. When we examine the other half of the scarf, we can see that that is true as well, that these were all knit toward that edge. So then we want to look and see, okay, how can we tell where this was started? So we have this middle section right here, and it's the only one we have. So this is the middle of the scarf. So at some point, so this was either knit that way or that way, which means that the scarf either started somewhere over here or somewhere over here. So let's look at this one up close. Once again, I'm going to be looking alongside these yarn overs, and sometimes it's tricky to see what's going on at this edge right here. It just depends on which direction decreases are pointed. But I have a single column of knit stitches right here, and then I have some edges right here that are going diagonally where I can see the single knit stitches. So I know that this center portion was knit in this direction. And I know that everything from here down was knit in that direction. So then the question is, which direction was this knit? Was this also knit in that direction, or was this knit in that direction? In other words, did I start with a provisional cast on here, or did I start with a provisional cast on here? So we need to look at this mesh pattern right here. So this mesh is very tricky to try to figure out. As we talked about in the previous video, with garter stitch, it looks the same right side up or upside down. So when you see the upper bump of garter stitch, that's like the head of a stitch, and anything that comes out of it is going to look like a full stitch as well. So this looks like, oh, 2 stitches, and then here's, and then they look like they're decreased together. But if I poke a little closer in here, that's not actually what I see. I see there is a stitch on top, and then underneath there I see a single strand. So this seems like it's a decrease, but I don't know for sure. So let me turn upside down this way, and it's going to look very similar to how it looked before, where you have the upper bump of a garter stitch, and you have these 2 stitches right here, and then you have a decrease. But if we look at this decrease, we can see that the stitch on top is a full stitch. And then if we poke in here and we look at what's underneath, we have 2 legs of a stitch. So this is a really tricky fabric to try to figure out in terms of the direction of the knitting. We do know the direction of the knitting of the 2 things above and below. But it does look like this is the starting point. There was a provisional cast on done where this ridge of garter stitch is, and this mesh knit, and then the fabric after that was all knit in this direction, and then the rest of the fabric was knit in that direction. I have 2 little swatches here. One was done with increases and one was done with decreases, because I wanted to kind of go over how you identify, how you tell the difference between something that is a decrease versus something that's an increase when you're not sure what direction something was knit. So these are both in stockinette. So let's look at them up close. So this is the one that has decreases. So we can see right here we've got 2 columns of stitches, and then we've got this decrease. So that this is what we call a left leaning decrease, because this column on the right is maintained while the column on the left disappears. So it looks like this decrease is leaning to the left. So that would be done with like an SSK or a SKP, a slip 1, knit 1, pass slip stitch over. You can lift this up and you can see that there is a full stitch underneath that, so that you can tell that this is actually a decrease, because there are actually 2 full stitches. One is just on top of the other. Right here I've got this vertical line, so I used a double decrease. So that's a nice way, because if you have this identifiable ridge like this of double decreases, a central double decrease, that's what you're always looking for, is that single line of knit stitches that tells you the direction of your knitting. Over here we have a knit 2 together, and so again we have 2 columns of stitches. We've got one right here and then one right here, and then they merge together, and this time the stitch on the left ends up on top of the other one. That's a left or a right leaning decrease. It's a knit two together. And again, if we look underneath here, we can see we can see the full stitch under there. We can see both legs of the stitch are there. So these are decreases, and so if you know that you have something with decreases, poke around at them so that you can see, oh yeah, this is a left-leaning decrease. I can see both stitches. So this is a swatch that has increases in it, and I used different kinds of increases. I used a knit front back here, I used a make one increase here, and then I used a lifted increase here. So when you look at a knit front back, you see that you've got this column of stitches that is just maintained, and then to its left you see something that looks like a purl bump at the base, and then you see another column of stitches coming up from it. So that tells you that was a knit front back, because you've got one column of stitches here, now you've got two columns, and you've got that bump at the base. With make one increases, these are make one left, but you can have a make one right also. You have this twisted loop at the base of the new column of stitches, and it is between two existing stitches. So a knit front back was created by turning this stitch into two stitches, and so the bump is between two previous columns. But this was created by knitting into one stitch two times, where this is created between two existing stitches by creating a twisted loop. There's a few different ways of doing that, but then you get that column of stitches going up. The one that is over here, these are often considered invisible increases when they are done in stockinette, and typically you want to do them several rows apart from each other. What you see here is you've got one long leg of a stitch and you've got two shorter ones. So this new stitch seems to be coming out in this direction. All of a sudden now you have two stitches. So this is created by creating a new stitch into a stitch that's below the needle. You're using a stitch below the needle in order to create the new column of stitches. And so you get this elongated leg over here and then the two short ones here. For this one, you can have a mirrored version of that, but you can see how this one column becomes two columns. Whereas in these other examples, you just get a column that appears between existing columns. And that's not what's going on here. So this is the increase that is the most difficult to tell apart from a decrease when you look at it upside down. So if I'm looking at this upside down, it looks like, oh, I've got these two columns of stitches, and it looks like this is crossing over another stitch so that that one is underneath. But we've only got one leg here. We don't have a full stitch underneath here. And if you look closely here, you've got that elongated leg here, and then you've got two short ones there. So this, when you look underneath, you can see, and you can check for whether you see one strand or if you see a full stitch under there. But you don't see that with this increase. So let's come look at that make one increase. That can also be a little deceptive, where you're looking at these and all of a sudden it becomes one column, and are you seeing an increase or a decrease? So again, you just want to pull things apart and see what is actually creating, you know, what's going on. And there's just this single strand right here. And always, if you're unsure based on the direction you're looking at something, you turn it around in the other direction and then look to see if it makes more sense in this direction. And here you can see that twisted loop and a full column of stitches above it. A lot of knitters really dislike swatching and think it's a waste of time or yarn, but the purpose of a swatch is to learn something, whether it's about the yarn and needles or a particular stitch pattern or a technique. If you want to learn more about how to tell the direction of knitting in a particular type of stitch pattern, knit up a swatch so that you know which direction is up, and then examine it from each direction to see where the clues are. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.